Most of us have moved past forcing eye contact or quiet hands, but the gap between neurodivergent needs and society's expectations runs much deeper. What happens when we set goals that make kids fit into classrooms that are too loud, cafeterias that are overwhelming, or peer groups that don't accept them? Are we teaching authentic skills or teaching them to mask just to get by? Welcome to Action Insights, the intersection between ABA and mental health. Today, we are talking about the gap that exists between neurodivergent needs and society expectations. My name is Nikki Dione, and this is my co-host.
Neely Delphonse. And today we're going to discuss that gap that exists between what society expects and what neurodivergent individuals really need. And this is a topic that I could really dig into. Um, and I think that I'm sure a lot of you have some strong opinions about it as well. Um, Essentially what we're looking at is the disconnect between the sensory auto, auto
Autonomy.
autonomy, but I want to say atomic, but it's not. Um, their communication skills and all of those things that are different for neurodivergent individuals than they are for the more neuromajority individuals, and especially in group settings. And this comes out a lot, but we also see it in the expectations in the community, in a grocery store or a clothing store or a library where they're expected to be quiet. I see it a lot in schools. And so I'm interested to talk about that experience as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I always I feel like I come with disclaimers sometimes. So today we're focusing specifically on neurodiversity and like the neuromajority. But I think a lot of what we talk about can be applied out when there's a marginalized or minority group that is within, a group that is considered a majority or non-marginalized group, right? So like a lot of the things we're talking about probably could apply out, but we're specifically talking about neurodiversity. And you might hear us use the term gap. I was giggling about it before because I said it like 800 times. And so the gap that we're talking about is what happens for an individual when our needs and our like who we are and what we need don't align with kind of the larger societal expectation. And that creates what we call dissonance. I always call it the distress gap, right? So like we're kind of talking about what happens in that middle part. Right. I mean, that's kind of where my brain jumps. And like what happens when my needs or like who I am as a neurodiverse individual doesn't align with the environmental expectations or that I'm in, which I think is such an important thing to kind of think about.
Yeah, especially for those individuals who can't speak for themselves
Right.
or who can't identify what their needs are or where that gap actually falls. So I'm supporting a 6-year-old autistic boy in a classroom, and he's fantastic, but he's having some challenges, and he's trying to figure out kind of his role in the classroom. So it's interesting because I've known him for years. I've started with him when he was 2, and then last year we graduated him from services, and I've just come back into his life. Mom is paying me out of pocket just to do a little bit of support in the classroom. And it's interesting to see how different he is a year later in a group setting because we're providing home-based services. And so now I can see him trying to compare himself to other kids and saying, this person, she's good, she's kind, she's nice. I'm bad, he'll say, or I'm mean. And he's not mean. He's being a little oppositional right now, and I'm trying to figure out where that's coming from, but he's very sweet and he can be very kind, although some of the things that he says, because he's missing some of the social skills. Like he wants to be a good person, but he feels like he's not. And so he's almost like giving up and trying to assume the identity, if that makes sense, of somebody who's not nice because it's
Yeah.
easier for him because then he doesn't have to try as hard.
Yeah. Oh, that makes me that makes me so sad.
Oh,
And
tell
actually,
me about
as
it.
you're talking, I have two thoughts. One of them is from a mental health perspective. I always like to clarify, and I can't remember if I've said this before, so I apologize if I'm repeating myself. But when I see autistic individuals in therapy, they're not seeing me because they're autistic.
Right.
They're in therapy because of the depression, anxiety, trauma, self-identity issues that occur because of this gap that we're talking about.
Mhm.
Um, and what you just talked about is what this child is experiencing, right? Like he may not be able to say, oh, I feel this because of this, and that's why, right? Like he may not be able to say that, but we can assume based off of what you know of this child and the environment that he's in and what he's seeing and what he's doing, that he's experiencing the distress that's happening in that gap of this is who I am, but I don't see myself really fitting because the response from the environment is aversive or,
Yep.
negative or punishment-y. So therefore, I'm going to shift here, but I don't understand how to do that, and then this is easier, right? So it's that gap piece. So that's kind of my first thought. And most kids developmentally, how old is this kid?
He's 6.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I mean, through age and stages, like kids look to we know that peer mentors are like the most strong kind of social development stuff, right? So kids like look to their to their peers naturally, regardless if you are neuromajority or neurodivergent. The difference is the response of people in the environment and how they respond to the behavior
Right.
that like kids are engaging in, right? So if a kid feels like they're bad, where is that coming from? And it's coming from this gap, most likely, right? Like
Yeah.
sometimes. Obviously,
Yeah.
there's other stuff, trauma history, everything else that we can put in, but we're specifically looking at those expectations. So, and I feel very sad for your little friend.
I do too. We've encouraged his teacher to start reading books around acceptance, neurodiversity, and autism. And she's been doing that, which I think has been helpful in helping his peers understand him better. I have noticed many of the kids are responding to him a little bit differently. And yesterday there was a 5-year-old in his class who came like up to him and they were in centers and they were doing magnetitles and she asked him if he wanted to build with her and she was so great with her. And it's interesting because I before yesterday had not seen her interact with him at all.
Mhm.
So, but she was just trying to mother hen him to death and was trying to take him under his wing, which of course he doesn't want because
Right.
he just doesn't like to be told what to do. But it was very nice to see. And when he said things that weren't necessarily kind, because he's very abrupt and right to the point in his communication, like if he wants something or if he doesn't want to give something to a peer, he doesn't hold any punches, he just tells them no.
That's just, yeah.
um and so when he does something like that, the peers look at me for advice on how to respond. And I'm
Yeah.
like, um if I give him a prompt just to say it more kindly, because it's usually his tone of voice that's an issue.
Right.
So it's not wrong for him to say, no, I'm not going to share these tiles. It is a little bit not very nice to snap and say it with like a mean, harsh tone. And that's something that we've been kind of working on a little bit.
Right.
I have recommended to his mom that he see a therapist who understands autism because this kid, I think, really needs it. But for a lot of different reasons. I mean, what's going on in the classroom is definitely a big part of it. And it's interesting because this classroom in particular has really high expectations of everyone. And
Mhm.
so a lot of times I think about whether or not we even have the right expectations for all kids,
Right.
So the teachers very much believe in a quiet classroom, that the kids shouldn't be talking. They want it absolutely quiet. She does a lot of choral teaching, so they need to be responding when she expects it and then silent any other time. And a lot of times it's like when she sends you back to your table, like if they're at the rug reading a story, go back to your table, put your head down.
Yeah.
And it's always go back to your table, put your head down. I'm like, these kids are 5 and 6 years old. And they sit for hours on end doing worksheets.
Which is so interesting because what we know, like brain development wise, I'm getting off a side note, but like sitting still and being quiet are actually higher level function skills that the brain is not designed to do when you're that age, right? But then we send kids to school where they're expected to sit for like very long periods of time. And, there's times where they have to be very quiet but their brains aren't developed that way. And so then you have kids who like will speak out or be wiggly or get up from their chair. And, it's these natural kind of body nervous system responses. Um, we can save that for a later date, but it does kind of set some kids up for more failure who can't just do it. Does that make sense? Who can't just force their body into doing it. Um, but yeah, I mean, and I think what happens too in those situations, and I'm not saying this for your kids specifically, is, we know that there's an increase in masking. We know that kids feel less self-efficacious, right? Self-efficacy decreases, all the self-hyphen words, self-confidence, like esteem is impacted. When we feel like there's a lack of autonomy, we see like an increase in behavior, or we see kids completely shut down and pull back. And so that's where kind of that, gap from at least a mental health perspective, right, starts to create challenges with mood and mental health, with depression and anxiety. It can create internalized ableism where people start to believe that their differences are not okay, right? And then they start to just like kind of self-discriminate, like discriminate against themselves, um, which all leads to harm in the long run, right? Like that's the danger of the gap for many, many neurodiverse individuals.
Oh, and we're, as professionals who are supporting kids in these environments, we're in a tough spot too, because we are there to support our child in being successful in this environment, but we're also advocates for what they need, but their needs can't be met in that environment. So I think we're all kind of in an interesting situation right now. And I feel like educators need to have more exposure to some of this information. I'd love to talk more with educators. And I think just reading the children's books for the class has been an education for this teacher as well, in helping her understand him. And it's was interesting at the beginning, her perspective of him versus after a few weeks of me kind of talking about his experiences. And she didn't understand the rigidity and he just kind of gets stuck on things sometimes. And she didn't understand those pieces, that's just part of who he is. And we can't expect him to be something that he's not, and that it's okay. And we just help him manage in that moment. And she's really starting to accept more about who he is, but still has really high expectations for everybody in the classroom.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, as you're talking, I'm thinking too, like how I do think we're in a really tough position, right? Like, especially when we think about, I was thinking about the school, and when I talk to people in the trainings I've gone to, is like, whose social validity matters, right? Or like, who are we kind of like, whose goals are we working on? And when you're a BCBA and you're in a school, you're not just dealing with your client. You have your client, the parents, the teacher, the other kids in the class, the administration, like it just gets so complex. And sometimes, as a reminder, like the best place to start is that information sharing. I am not a teacher. If somebody put me in a classroom, right, and I don't understand anything about education, the likelihood that I'll make missteps, right? Or mistakes or kind of live in my world increases. And so when information is shared, it can, I mean, not always 100% of the time, and the person has to be open to it, but it can really create a pathway, right? Um, and we know that sometimes closing the gap isn't changing the neurodiverse child to be more like neurotypical or neuromajority. It's what does it look like when now these kids have information, right? Just that book, reading about it, then they understand and they're like, okay, I understand. And it's okay if they still get frustrated and it's okay if things are still distracting. How do they communicate that? But it provides a better foundation, right? So that that space isn't so large. It like shrinks it a little bit.
Yeah. And I think it's also helpful in helping them understand that they're all kind of different, you
Yeah.
know. And so when a lot of these books are written to understand differences, not just understanding neurodiversity or autism, a lot of them are written to understand that everybody is different and everybody makes mistakes and is imperfect and is going to say things that might be hurtful. And how do you react to those things? But it's become such a small piece of the curriculum that's in these classrooms, you know. So in this classroom, they're working on addition and um like it's not your it's not the kindergarten class that we were in where
Or you
we
just get to like color and hang
yeah
out with their friends and like
it's
genuinely.
not that.
Yeah.
You know, there's a lot of real work that goes on, but I don't know how much learning goes on. And I could go into our school system a lot, but for this kid in particular, but for a lot of other kids, we're forcing them to do these worksheets. But what are they learning from the worksheets? Especially things like numbers. Are they getting any number sense from this without the inclusion of some manipulatives? Because my kid's not the only kid in the class who's really struggling with the concepts.
Right.
So,
That is a lot of pressure in general, specifically academics. And I couldn't imagine. I think back to my kindergarten class. My teacher was lovely. And I was learning things. I
yeah,
was learning how to engage in an environment and ask for help and engage socially with others. And, like I was learning a lot of things that may not have been like addition and subtraction, but like, I was definitely still learning things. But there has been a big shift curriculum wise, I think.
yeah. And
It's
that's a
both.
lot of pressure. It's a lot of pressure on teachers too.
Yeah.
And they're held to high standards and they're judged based on the scores of the kids in their classroom.
Yeah. Yep. Side note, have we hit the age where I'm like, I remember when I was young and things were so different back then. Oh no, we'll have to talk about this later. When you're like, the kindergarten of today is not the kindergarten that we were in. I was like, oh, we've hit that age where now it's been years.
Definitely hit that age, you know,
Yeah.
so
And I think the learning piece too, right? Like the academics and sitting and doing worksheets and like it kind of brings in like what kind of skills are being taught and like is it about the learning part? Is it about the compliance part? Is it about expectations of school part? Like it's a lot that kind of goes into that.
yeah. And I'm in a unique position in this classroom where I'm able to kind of support a group of children at a time. Generally speaking, there's at least part of the time that I'm there where we're doing because when they break into centers, there's usually two different play-based centers. There's specific things that they're supposed to do while they're there, but they're more play-based. And so it gives me the opportunity to kind of work with the other children who are part of his group, and that group changes. So it's not always the same kids. It's
Yep.
often similar kids because there's the teacher did take my recommendation to avoid putting specific kids with my kid. Um, but I feel like I've had the opportunity to support some of the other kids in accepting and listening to my client, but also supporting him in standing up and advocating for himself, but using kind words and a kind tone of voice. I think it's really important for them to be able to self-advocate, but I don't think that they need to be mean about it. If that makes sense. It's fine for him to say, no, I'm playing with these, but
Hmm.
it's not fine for them to say, no, I'm playing with them.
Yeah.
Like there's a difference,
Yeah.
and my client can come across as mean. And so if I can help the other kids understand that he's not trying to be mean, that's just that he's still learning, and try to help him adjust his tone so he doesn't sound mean,
Hmm.
maybe we can start to bridge that gap. But it's like a two-sided thing where I'm not expecting him to fit the environment, and I'm not expecting the environment necessarily to fit him. Like, how do we bridge the gap and meet somewhere in the middle?
Right. Yeah, and as you're talking, I'm thinking because my brain goes, you know, I saw this online, the "Don't hear what I didn't say." Have you seen that before?
No, but I
Which
like that.
I love it because it helps remind me sometimes, especially around like communication and like how things are expressed. Um, if this kid wants to be with other kids, then his goal is to learn how to communicate more effectively so people are receptive, right, to his communication. I have older individuals who are like, meh, don't care. Literally, like their goal is, they're happy with the people that they talk to online. They don't need to have in-person stuff. And it helps me just like, don't hear what I didn't say, right? So like go away. It doesn't mean like I hate you. I never want to talk to you. Like you're the worst thing ever. It means give me space, right? Like, but we fill in things in context. Um, but yeah, I mean, I agree. I think that it's looking at what are the goals of the client, right? And how do we kind of meet in the middle? Because part of that relationship development is being able to, I say my thing, right? If I spoke to you that way and I was like, go, that's mine, and I was mean, the relationship tells us that you hopefully would be able to say to me like, okay, I'll give you space, but that really hurt my feelings how you said that, or like whatever you want, and then we work it out. And so those are the skills that you're focusing on and teaching, but it does bridge that gap, right? See, I told you we're going to say gap 800 times in this episode. um so that if it's the client's goal, then he can feel successful in that environment, and you're also touching into other stuff for other kids and the teacher and all of that. I think a lot too around talking to you about this. And then I think I mentioned before, I work with adults, like older, well, maybe more transition aged, adults too, in therapy. And, a lot of the things that we're talking about is kind of undoing the harm, especially years ago. Like I think
Yeah.
10, 15, 20 years ago, the practice in school in general was just, much different than it is now. And I even think about one person who I started meeting with, and they were making the most direct eye contact I've ever seen in my entire life. They just were staring. And I was like, am I uncomfortable? Are they uncomfortable? And so I just remember asking this young adult, can you tell me what your experience has been like with other providers around areas like sitting still and eye contact, right? I just kept it very broad because I didn't want to be like, your eye contact is intense. And they shared that one of their IEP goals in school, now mind you, 10, 15-ish years ago, was that they had to learn how to make eye contact. They brought in their IEP, and I can only tell you how appalled I was. Now, again, this was years ago,
Yeah.
um, because that's what was expected to be socially typical, right? To kind of look unidentifiable from peers. And the second I said, in here, if you would like to do something different, that is okay. Like, I was like, I don't even make eye contact, which I don't. I like stare at people's nose or their mouth or their ear. And the shift in therapy, just like you could just see it, right? Like, and again, I'm not talking behaviorally, I'm talking mental health. Like, you just see the shift of like, oh, I have choice in here. I don't have to be uncomfortable and make super intense eye contact with you. And it was such a shift, right? And we think, and I know I'm hoping people are not working specifically on eye contact in services, but we think about something that is taught, right? Eye contact. A lot of neurodivergent, neurotypical or neuromajority people, like eye contact's whatever, you know. Um, and just that shift and how much that what to me is like, yeah, do whatever you want, but to that person, that gap like completely, you know, got very, very narrow. And that's kind of what we're talking about today, right? Like those things that we do because that's what society expects. And then what does that long-term piece? That's what I'm always thinking. What's that long-term part look like for the individuals that we're supporting?
Right. And so the question becomes like, what are our steps to doing some of this stuff? And I think that it's important that we continue to listen to those neurodivergent voices that are coming up online, or in person a lot of times. And we need to be respectful when they speak and are critical of what ABA does. A lot of times we can feel defensive because we might respond with, well, but I don't do that.
Right.
So if somebody online says something about forcing eye contact, and our gut reaction is like, well, but I don't do that, so I'm okay.
Mhm.
Um, but we need to be hearing and validating their experiences because that's been their experience. And whether or not you choose to have that as a goal, that's your personal choice, but that doesn't diminish that person's experience. And it's important that we are respectful of the people who are sharing their personal experiences.
Yeah. And the likelihood that we at some point have written, taught, done an intervention or a goal based off of society or environmental expectations is very high.
Yes.
Like, I mean, I've not met every single person who's in the field of, you know, behavioral science, but I could probably say with some confidence at some point in your learning or career, you set the goal. And so it's understanding that it can happen. It maybe not be eye contact specifically because we have a lot of information about it now, and the likelihood that we all have been there at some point exists.
Right.
So I agree.
And there's
And
other things that we're doing now that in 10 years we're going to learn, and that's harmful too. So we're going to shift and change the way that we're practicing. It's a practice. We're only doing the best that we can in any given moment. And so we need to keep that in mind that we're constantly evolving, and we need to be accepting of criticisms, and we need to be involving our clients as much as possible in the treatment planning.
yeah,
So this 6-year-old that I'm working with, he should be a part of what his goals are. And I'm not providing ABA necessarily, I'm just providing some supports. But how often do we involve a 6-year-old in talking about what his goals are?
right. Yeah, and prospectively, this person I spoke about eye contact, you know, through treatment and stuff has come up that multiple times in their history in treatment. They said, "This makes me uncomfortable. I don't like it." And they were somebody who did not have vocal communication when they were younger, and they remember engaging in behaviors. Like this is the one thing for them, right? Their harm point. They remember telling people, regardless of who it was, that they didn't want to do it. So, you know, are we involving people? Are we looking at assent based practices, right? So even though this individual can tell me now they couldn't before in vocally, right? But they
Yeah,
were still letting their people know that they were really uncomfortable with that goal. And so how are we doing person-centered and assent-based practices and check and making sure that that's what we're integrating in, right? In addition to having people sit at the table and be involved in the goal-making process.
right. And fitting that into a structured environment that has high expectations for all kids.
Right. Yep. Yeah, and you know, something else that we can think about as we're assessing and intervening, like our skills increasing independence. I love like the idea of like building joy,
Yeah.
right? Like, are we building joy into the services that we're providing and access, or you know, are we just engaging in things that like allow for whomever's in the environment to like better manage the individual that we're, especially like or child that we're, you know, providing services to?
Yeah. Um, so I think I guess our steps for you who are listening is to be open to feedback from neurodivergent individuals, be thoughtful in your goals, help to share knowledge. And it's important that we don't make assumptions that people understand neurodiversity, um, and how that impacts their success in an environment and what strategies they could do to make the environment more inclusive. We can't change the environments that we don't have control over immediately. So this classroom that I'm in, I can't come in and just demand that the teacher make these changes. I have to build her trust and help her shape her understanding of neurodiversity and make incremental changes. Um, could I go in and make broad changes to make it a more inclusive environment? I'd love to do that.
You're like, yes, I
I
could.
would get a lot of pushback from the teacher. So I think it's important that we are careful in the way that we're approaching that, but that we are advocating for the needs of our kids, especially the ones who can't advocate for themselves in
Yeah,
those
that
types of environments.
yeah, that partnership piece is so important, right? Because when I leave eventually, if the partnership is not been a positive one, the likelihood that the people will slip back into, kind of old practices, exist. So I think it's such a good place to kind of pause and like think about for everyone moving forward. And I always, so what's your call to action? If there's one thing, kind of look at what we're doing with our clients. Like, what are your goals? Is there anything in what you're doing that might feel a little outside for what the client's benefit is? And then how do we start to kind of look at it with the things we've talked about today? So thank you
Yeah.
guys all for joining us for this episode. We really
Next
appreciate your
episode,
time.
we're going to be using the ACT matrix to talk about how we can bridge that gap even more. So thank you all for coming, and I appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.